Hello everyone and welcome to the Game Engine programming series where we write a game engine from scratch. In the last episode, we started working on the editor side of things again, and we mainly focused on a new feature that enables the user to switch between game projects. Now there is a menu through which we can open another project or create a new one. We also had to fix the Visual Studio Automation class by synchronizing data access and handling COM server callbacks using a message filter. In this episode, I'd like to spend some time on organizing assets. Right now, we also have a bug that triggers some assertion failure, but we are still able to create a geometry asset and save it to a file. What I'd like to have now is an asset browser so that we can see the assets that we have available to us in the game project. We can also use the browser to import assets and drag them around to use them where they are needed. Today, we will work on a basic functionality of this browser. We will add more capabilities later as we need them, such as drag and drop and copy and paste functions. Let's fix that assertion bug first. By the way, this bug was discovered thanks to Xlyoid, aka new video announcer on Discord. Clicking on retry will bring us to the location where the assertion fails. So it happens in our vector class in the begin function, which returns a pointer to the start of the data in the vector. In this case, it's fine if underscore data is a null pointer, because the first element in a null pointer is still a null pointer. Therefore, we don't need this assertion. However, for the end function, we do need to assert that size is not non-zero, while data is a null pointer. It wouldn't make sense to have a number of elements while our data buffer is not allocated, and that would indeed be a bug. So we need to have an assertion for that. Okay, now it works like a charm. Next, I'd like to fix a couple of other issues that I missed in the last episode. First, I need to move these couple of lines and run them on the STA thread, because they still call the COM server, which could be busy. I'd also like to rename this interface to iMessageFilter. It doesn't really matter what we call it though, as it really uses the GUID to import the interface. I also forgot to remove this for loop where we create a new C++ script for our game. Since the message filter will automatically retry our calls, we don't need to do this anymore and we can simply remove it. The final fix for today is using the correct regular expression for validating the script and project names. Again, it's fine to start a file name with a number, but that would cause problems in the script code because obviously identifiers in C++ can't start with a number. First, we can remove this line because we already sanitize our project names and we can assume that at this point we have a valid project name. To prevent a script or project name from starting with a number, we need to use a regular expression for a string that starts with a letter from the alphabet or an underscore, followed by 0 or more alphanumeric characters or underscore. Then we reject strings that don't match with this regular expression. Here is a handy website that you can use to evaluate your regular expressions and test them. If I put our regex string here, you can see that now anything that starts with a number and or contains non-alphanumeric characters will be rejected. Now we can start working on the content browser. I'll be designing the content browser in such a way that we can have multiple instances of it open at any time. So later when we have a docking manager and dockable panels, we can place one or more content browsers wherever we want. But for now, I'll just put it at the bottom half of the world editor next to the log and history panels. So let's add another column to this grid and add a grid splitter so that we can resize the panels. Add the namespace so that we can use the content browser view in the new grid column. I need to put the grid splitter in the correct column as well. There you go. I'd also like to set an initial size for the history column and make it less wide so that we have more room for log and content browser panels. Before creating the view model for the content browser, we need to have a centralized registry for all assets in the content folder. The purpose of this registry is to provide access and lookup functionality for everything that uses a reference to an asset. That includes our content browser. The asset registry is relatively simple. It's a static class with a dictionary of assets for lookup and a flat list of all assets in the content folder and all of its subfolders. We need a class to keep information about the assets. Let's add the asset info class on top of the asset.cs file. This class functions as a proxy for the asset classes without loading the asset data itself. For now, we need to know the type of asset, have an icon for it, as well as the full path to the asset file. We can get the file name from the full path like this. We also need to know where the asset came from, aka its source path. This is not always applicable though, so it's optional. Next are the import date, asset GUID, and hash. Import date is used to see if the source is newer than the asset file and therefore needs to be re-imported. The GUID is used to look up the asset, and the hash code is used to quickly compare assets to see if they are the same. To get the asset info, we need to open the asset file and read its header. I add a static method in the asset base class to perform this operation. First, we check if the file exists and it has the correct extension. Then we open it in a binary reader to read its header. This is an I/O operation, so I'm going to put it in a try-catch block. I would also like to factor out the actual reading part so that we can reuse it within this class. So let's add an overload of this method that accepts a binary reader and reads the fields within the asset file. It does the exact same thing as in writeAssetFile header method, but instead of writing to the file, it will read from it. That's all. Now we can use this method to also read the header. So we have read asset file header that will call getAssetInfo and copy its data. We'll need this method when we load an asset file. Since asset info is a proxy for our assets, let's have the same properties in the abstract base class for assets. Please note that when we change the full path of the asset, we also trigger a property changed event for its file name so that it gets updated on any UI control that's bound to it. Let's carry on with the asset registry class. After adding the dictionary, we also need a flat list of all assets. We can also bind to this list through a read-only observable collection. This is useful when we want to have a list of assets to select from. When we load a project, we need to empty the list and dictionary and load the information from the new project. Basically, we need to reset the asset registry. So first we clear the collections and then check if the content folder exists. Then we call register all assets, which will do exactly that. Here we get all files and directories in the given path parameter and loop through all of them. If an entry is a directory, we recursively call register all assets for this entry. Otherwise, it is an asset file which we can register in our collections. Let me first add a helper function to the content helper class, which we can call to determine if a path is a directory. Here we simply check the attribute of this path to see if it has the directory flag set. We will write register asset function next. If the file is not already in the dictionary, or if it is newer than the one in the dictionary, then we need to add it or update it in the collections. To get the asset info, we call the method that we just wrote in the asset class. Then we add the information to the dictionary, as well as the list of assets. Of course, I need to write an extension method that compares two instances of datetime to see if one is older than the other one. Let's put this one in the content helpers too, although it has more to do with dates, but for now it's okay to put it here, I guess. As I mentioned earlier, we need to reset the asset registry when we load a project. That's when we return from choosing or creating a project in Project Browser dialog. Here we can get the path to the project's content folder and reset the asset registry, which in turn will register all assets in this project. Now I can create an asset and then reload the project to see if it works. You can see here that we have a new geometry asset file. When we reload the project, it should get added to the collections in the asset registry. Setting a breakpoint and inspecting the collections, we can see that we indeed have one item in there that corresponds to our asset file. Obviously, we don't want to have to reload the project every time we add a new asset file. We would rather give the asset registry the ability to detect changes within the content folder and register any files that are added or modified. We also want to unregister the files that are removed or renamed. We can use a FileSystemWatcher to detect changes in a directory and configure it to include subdirectories too. Using the notify filter, we can also decide for what type of changes we would like to get notified. In our case, we only want to get notified when something is created, renamed, or written to. Before clearing the collections, we suspend notifications by setting Enable Raising Events property to false. Then we reset the asset registry and we enable these notifications again for the new content folder. To handle the notifications, we can attach an event handler to the events that we are interested in. So we want to know when something is changed, created, deleted, or renamed. This holds for both asset files and directories. We can handle all 4 kinds of events using a single event handler. Let's see what happens if I set a breakpoint here and create a new asset. This time, let's create a plane. The event handler gets called, which is good. However, if I press F5 to continue, you can see that it gets called multiple times. This is because the file is created and written to, and probably some other OS operations happen as well, which trigger our events. We could try to figure out what event was sent for which reason and handle the ones that are relevant, but that would need extensive testing to account for each kind of situation. Plus, you would probably need to learn Windows file system access events by heart. Instead of doing that, it's easier, and I think also less error-prone, to use our good old DelayEventTimer class. As I mentioned when I wrote that utility class, it must only be used for situations when the same event handler is called repeatedly within a short time interval, and it's out of programmer's control to reduce the repetition. What it boils down to is that if we didn't get notified for 250 milliseconds, then we are going to handle the events. First of all, we are only interested in asset files for now. Also, it's worth knowing that the FileSystemWatcher will call the event handler from another thread. So we need to put anything that modifies our observable collection to run on the UI thread. We can do this using the current dispatcher. In this case, we are triggering the refresh timer, which is a dispatcher timer and should also be accessed on a UI thread. And we attach an event handler to refresh timer's trigger event, which is called after 250 milliseconds. Before we go any further, I would like to point out that when onContentModified method is called multiple times, it will get different file system event arcs each time. However, our DelayEventTimer only accepts one data item which will be overwritten each time trigger method is called. Because in case of asset registry, we really need to know all event arcs, I'm going to change our utility class to account for that. To do so, I simply make this data field a list of objects which we can add to every time trigger is called. After calling the event handler, which may or may not use this data, we clear the list for the next round. In asset registry's refresh method, we loop through all items and unregister assets that were deleted or don't exist anymore. The remaining options are when an asset was created or renamed, and in both cases we will register it. I forgot to change the data property in DelayEventTimer args. Now we can properly pass the list of event args to our event handler. Next, we need to implement onRegisterAsset method, which simply removes the asset info from the collections. Let me set a breakpoint here for testing and see what happens when we create another asset. Let's make another sphere and save it. Now we can see that we have 4 event args here. Just stepping through the code, I see 2 issues. First, we need to add an asset info to the assets lists only if this condition is true. So we need to move these lines up into the if scope. Second, import date is by definition always older than the last write time, because we first import an asset or create one and then write it to an asset file. So what we really need is the time when this asset was registered in the asset registry. Let's add a new property in assetInfo class to hold this information. Now we remember the time when we register an asset, and if later the same asset has a last write time that is more current, then we know that we have to update the registry. Let's try again and remove the assets that we already have. Now we have 3 event args that correspond to the 3 files we deleted. Creating a new sphere asset, we get 4 event args, but this time we get an exception. I believe this is because we are trying to read our file too soon. When we create a file, it will take some time for the operating system to release it for access. As you can see here, we get a file not found exception, while we already do have a file sitting in the content folder. So this is a synchronization problem that we can solve by turning off the FileSystemWatcher before we write to a file, and turning it on again afterwards. However, for now, I'll leave it like this, because we have got a lot more to do before we have a clear architecture for this, and also the other event args will cause the new asset file to register just fine. That's pretty much all for now. I'd like to add a couple of accessor functions to get asset information given a file name or a GUID. Next time, we are going to add the view model for the content browser. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you join me on Patreon, you'll get access to the code on GitHub, so you don't have to type everything over from the video. Plus there are also other nice goodies and rewards exclusive to my Patreon supporters. Please use the link in the video description to check them out. I hope to see you next time. Until then, take care and happy game engineering!